Now we're going to look at the late Middle Ages and the late medieval crisis. Here are the terms. Make sure you get them all. The Church, you'll recall, spread its influence across Europe during the early Middle Ages. By the High Middle Ages, both popes and monarchs were extending their authority. The monarchs are consolidating their kingdoms, unifying them. In the early 1200s, Pope Innocent III claimed broad new powers. He said, "The priesthood is the sun and the monarchy the moon. Kings rule over their respective kingdoms, but the Pope rules over the whole earth." So what we see is that with secular rulers advancing their own claims to power, some explosive conflicts erupted. The longest and most destructive struggle pitted the popes against the Holy Roman emperors, who ruled the lands from Germany to Italy. In the early Middle Ages, Emperor Charlemagne had brought much of what's today the nation of Germany under his rule. After his death, if you'll recall, this kingdom dissolved into a patchwork of separate states ruled by a number of powerful counts and dukes and princes. In time, the dukes of one of those states is going to begin to extend his own power. This is Otto I, or Otto the Great as he was known. He began to extend his power over the neighboring German lands, and he was the Duke of Saxony, which was one of those states. In 936, he took the title King of Germany. Like Charlemagne, he worked closely with the church. He appointed bishops and abbots to top government jobs, men who were loyal to him. Also, like Charlemagne, he took an army south into Italy to help the Pope put down a rebellion by Roman nobles. In 962, a grateful Pope crowned Otto emperor. And later, Otto's successors take the title Holy Roman Emperor. Holy because they were crowned by the Pope. Roman because they saw themselves as heirs to the emperors of ancient Rome. And Otto is sometimes considered to be the first Holy Roman Emperor because from this point forward we will have someone holding that title. If you recall, a century and a half before, Charlemagne was given that title by the Pope, but after his death, there's no more Holy Roman Emperor for 150 plus years. And so Otto is considered to be the first. And here you see the Holy Roman Empire, that area in purple for the most part. And this empire had the potential to be the strongest monarchy in Europe. German emperors claimed authority over much of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as parts of France and Italy. But in fact, the real rulers of these lands were the emperor's vassals, hundreds of dukes, counts, archbishops, bishops, and knights. And for the German emperors, the challenge was to control these nobles. But in the end, as you'll see, it was a challenge that was never met. The close ties between Otto and the Church actually held the seeds of conflict. Holy Roman emperors saw themselves as protectors of Italy and the Pope. They repeatedly crossed the Alps to intervene in Italian affairs. They were tempted also by the desire to control the rich cities of northern Italy. A key conflict between emperors and popes rose over who would control appointments to high church offices. Like secular rulers in England and France, the Holy Roman Emperor often decided who would become the bishop or the abbot in his churches. And we see a series of reforms called the Cluny Reforms strengthening the church. And as this is happening, we see the popes trying to end outside interference, like the rulers appointing their own people. Under the reforming Pope Gregory VII, and I've mentioned him before, the conflict between emperors and the church just burst into flames. Gregory was one of the greatest medieval popes, but he was also among the most controversial. He was determined to make the church independent of secular rulers, and to do so, he banned the practice of lay investiture. Under this practice, the emperor or another lay person, and that just refers to someone who's not a member of the clergy, invested or presented bishops with the ring and staff that symbolized their office. And what was happening was that these rulers were handpicking the men that they wanted to serve in these positions, men whose first loyalty would be to them, and then installing them in office. And Gregory said no, only the Pope has the right to appoint and install bishops in office. This conflict became known as the investiture controversy, and this just refers to this conflict between the popes and the secular rulers over who had the ultimate authority to select and appoint and invest bishops and abbots and clergy with their spiritual power. So the Pope has banned the practice of investiture, and his ban brought an angry response from Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. He argued the bishops held their lands as royal fiefs, and that made him their overlord. And as their overlord, he felt entitled to give them the symbols of office. So we have a feud between Gregory and Henry, and the feud heats up as the two men exchange insulting notes. Meanwhile, the rebellious German princes and nobles saw a chance to undermine Henry by supporting the Pope. Now, Henry had a lot of enemies because of some of his practices, like taxing his people ruthlessly, for example. And so this feud heats up and heats up until we get to 1076, and Gregory excommunicates Henry and deposes him as king or Holy Roman Emperor. And this frees his subjects from their allegiance to him. The Pope then heads north to crown a new emperor. And soon the German lands were embroiled in a civil war, as the German lords used the quarrel to strike at Henry's power. The princes declared that they would not recognize Henry as king until the ban of excommunication was lifted, and they invited Gregory to meet them in Germany. So Gregory is traveling to Germany to crown the new king. Henry, meanwhile, is panicking. He does not want Gregory to come to Germany and stir up his rebellious subjects, so he shrewdly plans to journey to Italy and appeal to Gregory to remove the stigma of excommunication. In January of 1077, Henry crossed the icy Alps into northern Italy. He found the Pope staying at a castle at a place called Canossa. The Pope was on his way to Germany to preside at a meeting called by the German lords to elect a new king. Henry arrives at the castle January of 1077, so as you can imagine, they're in the Alps, the Italian Alps, so it's really cold, and the Pope makes him wait out there for 3 days. Henry presents himself as a repentant sinner, and Gregory later described the scene. There, having put aside all the trappings of royalty, with bare feet and clad only in a wretched woolen garment, Henry continued for 3 days to stand before the castle gate, beseeching us with tears to grant him absolution and forgiveness. Now, how repentant do you think Henry really was? Gregory knew that Henry was only trying to save his throne. But according to the tradition and law of the Church, the Pope, as a priest first, had to forgive a confessed sinner. So Gregory lifted the order of excommunication. Henry's back in business. He quickly returns to Germany to subdue his rebellious nobles. And he never forgot what Gregory did. And in later years, he actually took revenge on Gregory when he led an army to Rome and forced the Pope into exile. The struggle over investiture dragged on for almost 50 years. Finally, in 1122, both sides accepted a treaty known as the Concordat of Worms. In it, they agreed that the Church had the sole power to elect and invest bishops with spiritual authority. The emperor, though, had the right to invest them with fiefs. Although this compromise did end the investiture struggle, we see new battles soon raging between popes and emperors. During the 1100s and 1200s, ambitious German emperors tried to master Italy. The Emperor Frederick I, called Barbarossa or Redbeard, and he's the one I mentioned during the Crusades, who drowned really just upon entering the Holy Land. But he dreamed of building an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic. And for years he fought to bring the wealthy cities of northern Italy under his control. But with equal energy, they resisted. By joining forces with the Pope, they managed to defeat Barbarossa's armies. He did succeed, though, in arranging a marriage between his son Henry and Constance, an heiress to Sicily and southern Italy. That move entangled German emperors even more deeply in Italian affairs. Sicily was a rich island kingdom in the Mediterranean. It had a very sophisticated court where Muslim and Christian influences existed side by side. The child of Henry and Constance was Frederick II, and he was raised in this rich court. He was bright and well educated, fluent in Arabic, Greek, French, and several other languages. He valued the scientific learning of the Muslim world, and he saw himself as a man of reason. He was also an arrogant, able, and cynical leader, willing to use any means to achieve his ends. As Holy Roman Emperor, he didn't spend hardly any time in Germany, in his empire. Instead, he pursued his ambitions in Italy, and there he clashed repeatedly and unsuccessfully with several popes. Like his grandfather, Frederick also tried but failed to subdue the cities of northern Italy. So what were the consequences of this? Well, while Frederick was embroiled in Italy, he gave in to many demands of his German nobles. As a result, they grew increasingly independent. And although the Holy Roman Empire survived, it remained fragmented into many feudal states. So the emperors lost control of Germany at a time when French and English rulers were building the foundations for stable, unified governments. The German people paid a high price for their emperor's ambitions. They're not going to achieve unity for another 600 years. Southern Italy and Sicily also faced centuries of upheaval. There, popes turned to the French to overthrow Frederick's heirs. A local uprising against French rule in Sicily led to 200 years of chaos as French and Spanish rivals battled for power. The region that had once been a thriving center of European culture was left in ruins. In the 1200s, the Roman Catholic Church reached its peak of power. Reforming popes like Gregory VII claimed the right to depose kings and emperors. Gregory's successors greatly expanded papal power. One of those successors was Pope Innocent III, who took office in 1198, and he embodied the triumph of the Church. As head of the Church, he claimed supremacy over all other rulers. The Pope, he said, stands between God and man, lower than God but higher than men, who judges all and is judged by no one. So that's a lot of power. And he clashed with all the powerful rulers of his day. And more often than not, the Pope came out ahead. As I mentioned before, when King John of England dared to appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury without the Pope's approval, Innocent excommunicated the king and placed his kingdom under an interdict, which meant no church services. Innocent ordered the same punishment for France when Philip II tried to unlawfully annul his marriage. The Holy Roman Emperor also felt the wrath of this powerful pope. In 1208, Innocent, aided by Philip II, launched a brutal crusade or a holy war against a sect in southern France known as the Cathari. Now, Catharism was the most radical heresy to confront the medieval church. This belief represented a mixture of several Eastern religious movements, including Gnosticism, which we've mentioned before. And these were movements that had competed with Christianity in the days of the Roman Empire. And the doctrines had been condemned as heretical by the early church. Well, Catharism was carried to Italy and southern France by Bulgarian missionaries, and it gained followers in regions where opposition to the worldliness and wealth of the clergy was already strong. The Cathari believed, among other things, that there was an eternal conflict between the forces of the God of evil and the God of good. Because the evil God, whom they identified with the God of the Old Testament, created the world, the earthly home was evil. The soul, though spiritual in nature, was good. Unfortunately, it was trapped in wicked flesh. Well, they wanted to purify the church and return to the simple ways of early Christianity. They believed the world was evil. They also believed that Jesus was an angel, not God. They taught that since the flesh was evil, Christ would not have taken a human form, so he could not have suffered on the cross or have been resurrected. They felt that the church, in its pursuit of power and wealth, had been created to enslave people. So the center for the Catharist heresy was southern France, where a strong tradition of protest existed against the moral leniency and materialism of the clergy. When the Cathari did not submit to peaceful persuasion, the Pope, Innocent II, called on the kings and lords to exterminate Catharism with the sword. And this led to 21 years of a brutal crusade. This holy war lasted for 21 years, and tens of thousands of people were slaughtered. In the end, though, Catharism was pretty much wiped out. For almost a century after Pope Innocent's death, popes pressed their claim to supremacy. During this period, though, the French and English monarchies were growing stronger. The papacy, on the other hand, enters a period of decline. We see problems in other areas as well. The late Middle Ages could be called a time of crisis, and in fact the 14th century, the 1300s, is often referred to as the late medieval crisis, and it consists of three things: the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, the 100 Years' War, and what's known as the crisis of the church. But let's start by looking at the Black Death. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships left the Black Sea port of Caffa and sailed for Messina, Sicily. By mid-voyage, sailors were falling sick and dying. Soon after the ships tied up at Messina, townspeople also were getting sick. They were dying. Nobody knew at first what was going on, but within months, the disease that Europeans called the Black Death was raging through Italy. By 1348, it had reached Spain and France, and from there it ravaged the rest of Europe. It's estimated that 1 in 3 people died, possibly more, worse than any war in history. The sickness was the bubonic plague, a disease that we know was spread by fleas on rats. So here you can see the movement. You can kind of trace the movement of the disease. It's thought that it may have first struck Mongolia in 1331 or 1332, and from there it crossed into Russia. And then it was carried back from the Black Sea ports, finally reaching Sicily in 1347. So, it's carried on these ships which carry rats. They're putting into all these ports and unknowingly spreading the disease as they go. Because they did not know what they were dealing with, the attempts to stop the plague were not based on any type of science. Here you see on the left the doctor's robe. The doctors of that time, such as they were, would cover their bodies, as you can see, and they would wear a beaked mask. Now, inside that beak, they would put herbs or a tiny bit of flowers. The idea was that it would cover up the stench of illness and death, but there was also the belief that it could help prevent disease. And then you see the stick that he's holding. They actually use that to treat patients. They would reach out and touch the patient as they're trying to diagnose with the stick. They didn't actually usually lay hands on them. One idea was that maybe there was poison in the blood. So the idea was to suck that poison out through the use of leeches. And so leeching was one of the common types of treatment. Not usually very effective because that wasn't the problem. Many people thought that the plague was God's punishment on man as a result of his sinfulness. And so groups of men who were usually monks or priests called flagellenti, or the flagellants, would travel in groups from town to town, chanting and whipping themselves. The idea being that they were trying to show penance for their sins. So if any of you have ever seen the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's a scene where a group of monks comes wandering through the town, beating themselves in the face with boards. That's based on this group here, the flagellenti. In many communities, the Jews were not actually as hard hit as the rest of the community, mainly because they were cleaner than the rest of the population, and also because they tended to live kind of isolated in their own communities, so that would make it more difficult for the disease to spread. But because of that, there were many Europeans who thought, well, okay, they're not getting sick, so they must be behind it. And so they blamed the Jews for the plague, and there were pogroms against the Jews, and that refers to violent uprisings. You'd see entire Jewish communities burned to the ground, the people killed. In some communities, the Jews were forced to wear a golden circle on their clothing to outwardly identify themselves as Jewish. Does that sound familiar? Think Nazi Germany. Well, the people back then had no idea what was causing this plague. We, however, do know. So what causes it? Well, the culprit is this, the Oriental rat flea. Now, these were everywhere in the Middle Ages because people were really dirty. And the fleas were carried on the backs of and the bodies of rats. So how was the plague transmitted? Well, we know, like I say here, the most common form was the bubonic plague. The disease was spread by fleas, which lived on the black rat. The fleas sucked the rat's blood, which was infected with the plague. When the rat died, the fleas need a new host. They jump onto humans and pass on the deadly disease. And as I said, this is a very dirty period of time. And so people, they're used to rats and fleas as part of their daily lives. They don't think anything of it. People, if they bathed at all, would bathe maybe once a year. They lived in homes with dirt floors and often dirt walls. Sometimes the animals lived in with them. You'd have animal refuse all throughout the streets. It's not like they had garbage pickup. Granted, they wouldn't have the same type of garbage we do today, but bottom line, very dirty. And this is a picture of a recent plague victim, a more modern plague victim. And if you see that growth on the back of her neck, that's called a buboes, that swelling, and that's where the word bubonic comes from. So here you see the cycle. The flea drinks the rat blood that carries the bacteria. The bacteria multiplies in the flea's gut. The gut's clogged with bacteria that's infected. Flea bites the human, regurgitates blood into the open wound, humans infected, and so forth. And as I said, the people living at this time had no idea that their living conditions actually contributed to the spread of the disease because they just lived in such filthy conditions, and it was a breeding ground for fleas and rats. So what were the symptoms of the plague? Well, there's going to be different strains. And with the first strain, you see here, day 1, painful swellings called buboes appear in the victim's armpits and groin, about the size of an egg, could be larger. Day 2, victim vomits and develops a fever. Day 3, bleeding under the skin causes dark blotches all over the body, and that's why they called it the Black Death, because when those black blotches, those dark splotches appeared, that was a sure sign you were a goner, that you had the disease. Day 4, the disease attacked the nervous system, caused the victim to suffer spasms, terrible pain. Day 5, sometimes the buboes burst and a foul-smelling black liquid oozed from the open boils. When this happened, the victim usually lived, but most of the times, painful death. Now, this is the initial strain. There are going to be other strains, including a viral strain, which was very fast acting. And you could catch it or be infected in the morning and be dead by evening. So here you see some present day forms or examples. You see the buboes on the girl's neck and then the black splotches under the skin, the blotches under the skin, which shows that if that happens, that means that there's nothing that can be done. Now, the plague does still exist today, but it can be treated with antibiotics. And there have been very few cases in the United States, only, I don't know, maybe 10 cases in the last decade or so with no deaths. One interesting thing I did read recently was that if you travel out west, prairie dogs have actually been found to carry the disease. But as I said, here in the United States, very few cases and very treatable. Now, you do have situations in like some third world countries where there have not been outbreaks along the lines of what we're talking about here, but you might see it more. So the people of this time had no idea, as I've said, what was causing this disease. Didn't know it was the way they lived, the rats, the fleas. They thought people's bodies were poisoned. And as you saw on an earlier slide, occasionally the buboes would burst, emit the foul-smelling liquid, and sometimes when that happened, the person might live. So they thought, okay, it bursts, the person lives, let's draw out the poison. That line of thinking led to one of the treatments, lancing the bubo. Now, this might have been successful and very occasionally it would work. Problem was, again, remember, they're not that familiar with the idea of cleanliness. And so you would have these physicians who were sometimes referred to as barber surgeons because many of them were also barbers by trade. And they didn't necessarily realize they were supposed to clean their instruments. So you might have a buboes lanced by a surgeon, and you might be the fourth, fifth customer he's had that day, and so he's lancing your buboes with an instrument that's covered with infection. So what happened a lot of times was the thing would be lanced. The person possibly might have survived, except that infection would set in, and that would usually kill them. So I want to read two of my favorite cures. So the swelling should be softened with figs and cooked onions. The onions should be mixed with yeast and butter. Then open the swellings with a knife. And then what you do is you take that mixture and you put it in, and supposedly it would draw out the poison, i.e. the infection. And here is my all-time favorite. Take a live frog and put its belly on the plague sore. The frog will swell up and burst. Keep doing this with further frogs until they stop bursting. Some people say that a dried toad will do the job better. So evidently these frogs actually would absorb the poison, the infection, and they literally would burst. But did it work? So, how useful do you think these medieval cures actually were? Think about it for a moment. Do you think they did help, or were they, like lancing the bubo, actually more harmful? Well, the sad reality is that they were not very useful at all. And the big reason for that is that the people, as I said, had no clue what they were doing. They had no clue what this disease was or how to treat it. And so they're surrounded by death, and with the very painful deaths of so many people in so short a time, death became a regular part of the artistic and cultural heritage of medieval Europe. And you begin to see images of death in song and in art, with a special emphasis on the message, "As I am now, so shall you be." And that's death speaking. And the Black Death just increased concern among the people about sin and death. One example of seeing this in the cultural heritage, many of you, when you were younger, may have played the game Ring Around the Rosie, a children's game. That came from the plague. Ring around the rosy, because those black blotches, before they became black, they would be rose-colored blotches on your skin. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy. People took to carrying a little posy or a little bunch of flowers in their pocket to ward off the smell of death. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down, because eventually they start burning the bodies. And so ashes, they're burning the bodies, we all fall down, everybody's dying. It's estimated that at least 1 million people died just in the first year to 2 years of the plague, and people felt totally helpless. Here you see an image of plague victims, and this is an illustration from a Bible. So you see the plague victims in the forefront, and then behind you see a man looking to the stars for an answer. Here's another idea of this idea of death being ever present and death always being triumphant. And
Bring out today!
Because the people again are surrounded by death. It's all they know. And yet another one. The people, as I said, have an obsession with death because they're surrounded by it. Here's an excerpt from a poem called the Decameron. The victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors. So this is referring to that viral form of the plague where, as I said, you could be okay earlier in the day, dead by dinner. And here you see the dance of death. The big artistic theme of this period of time is death triumphant. No matter what you do, death will triumph. Here's a poem from this period of time. A sickly season, the merchant said. The town I left was filled with dead, and everywhere these queer red flies crawled upon the corpses' eyes, eating them away. Fare make you sick, the merchant said. They crawled upon the wine and bread, pale priests with oil and books, bulging eyes and crazy looks, dropping like the flies. And the flies are everywhere because of the bodies. I had to laugh, the merchant said. The doctors purged and dosed and bled, and proved through solemn disputation the cause lay in some constellation. Then they began to die. First they sneezed, the merchant said, and then they turned the brightest red, begged for water, then fell back, with bulging eyes and face turned black, they waited for the flies. I came away, the merchant said. You can't do business with the dead, so I've come here to ply my trade. You'll find this to be a fine brocade. And that's a type of cloth. And then he sneezed. And so this is referring to that viral form of the plague and just kind of showing that nobody is immune. Now, Europe had seen the plague before. So why was it so deadly in the late Middle Ages? Well, in part, it was because of the way people lived. Between about 900 and 1300, the population of Europe had doubled. About 78 million people had pushed the European food supply to its limits. Thomas Malthus was an English economic philosopher who actually lived centuries later, but he gave his name to the theory of Malthusian crisis. Malthus argued that the population will continue to expand to the limits of its food supply, whether it be humans, roaches, or rats. And this is, in part, what helps to set up the Black Death. The rapid expansion of population meant that people were living on less and less food and on poorer quality food. Health was poor, and immune systems were weak because of this demographic crisis of pushing the food supply to the limit. Worsening this Malthusian crisis would be the arrival of what they referred to as the Little Ice Age. The first 4 decades of the 14th century were cold and wet with very short growing seasons. So what does this mean to a population that's already pushed its food supply to the limits? Well, it means that you're not going to have as much food. And so here you see things outlined. We get to 1315, and there's all these climate changes which result in massive crop failures. So you've got this huge population, you've got crop failures. That means they don't have enough food. As many as 15% of the peasants in some English villages died. And so why is this important for the plague? Well, because this happens several decades earlier. People are starving, living in poverty. They're much more susceptible to disease. Their immune systems are weakened. This is the population that's going to be impacted several decades later by the bubonic plague. They're just much more vulnerable to any disease. So had the population not been so stressed, it seems that the disease might not have been so deadly. And it's not the last time the plague will hit. Recurrences of the plague will occur in the 1300s, 1400s, every century. And the last known outbreak is in Moscow in 1778. So every century you're going to have an outbreak of the plague, but none of them are going to be as deadly as this one. How many people died? We really don't know, mainly because they didn't keep records back then like they do today. So the estimate is that anywhere from 35% to 60% of the population of Europe died. Up to 50 million people did. So, that's a huge number of death. This plague killed off millions of people, which in economic terms meant devastation. Every area of society was impacted by the plague. So what was the impact of the plague? Well, millions of people die, and so the labor supply is greatly reduced. Um, you don't have enough people to do the work, basically. Europe's workforce was cut by 1/3 to 1/2. Workers were dying off or running away, which resulted in wages for the remaining workers being raised. And landlords were in a tough position. Their workers were making demands because basically you'd have these landlords who would have, say, fields that needed to be tended, and they need those crops taken care of, but they only have half the workers. They're expecting those workers to do the jobs of twice as many men. So those workers begin demanding more money. They want more pay if they're going to do twice the work. And the landlords are really in a hard position because if they don't pay them to do the work, it just doesn't get done. Add to that, you've got rental income. Now, these lords, much of their income depends on the rent that these peasants pay. Well, half of the peasants who rented land for them are dead. So the rental income plunges, and yet these lords are expected to pay the same amount out, really, for those who are left. Cost of labor goes up, income goes down. The result, though, is that peasants gain more rights because all of a sudden they're very necessary. And this, in turn, helps to weaken the feudal system. We see a loss of faith in the church. Up to this point, in the people's eyes, the church can do no wrong. The clergy is infallible. The clergy is specially protected by God. And so this plague hits, people are terrified, they're questioning, nobody knows what's going on, they're turning to the church. But what are they seeing? They're seeing their priests, their bishops dying, just like everyone else. They're seeing their priests, their clergy running away in fear. And so they question, they're like, well, wait a minute, they're supposed to be specially protected. They're infallible, so how can this happen to them? And so we start to see the first cracks in the church. People during the Middle Ages lived their lives to get to heaven. So all of your actions are for that purpose. But now people are realizing, I'm living my whole life for the next life. I could be dead tonight. Why don't I just take a moment and enjoy the life I have right now? Why don't I see what I can accomplish in this life as opposed to waiting to the next? So kind of like the YOLO of the Middle Ages. That's a mindset that will lay the foundation for the Renaissance. We see the persecution of Jews. As I mentioned earlier, they're floundering, they're grasping at straws, looking for somebody to blame. And since many of the Jewish communities were not as hard hit, and because the Jews were pretty much separatists within many of the European cities, the fingers pointed at them. And so we see violent uprisings against the Jews. And, imagine what would it be like to live in a town impacted by the plague? People begin dying. And at first, the belief is that they need to be buried in hallowed ground at the church. But then they run out of room. Plus, so many people are dying, it's like who's going to do all the work of burying them? People don't want to come out and touch the plague victims. And plus, others are getting sick themselves. They're weakened. So bodies begin to literally pile up in the streets. Families are barricaded into their little houses, their little huts. And what do you do about that? Everything comes to a standstill. And then, as you saw with the art, the culture itself is impacted with this idea of death being ever present. So pretty much every area of society was impacted in some way by the plague. The bubonic plague is just one component of the late medieval crisis. A second is the Hundred Years' War, which, as you can see by the dates, actually lasted longer than 100 years. But this war will also contribute to the breakup of old feudal patterns. This war was not the type of total war with which we're familiar, not a world war, but a war of just a dramatic scale fought between England and France. Now, in earlier centuries, wars had generally been short and small in scale, sparing the non-combatants the worst effects. So, if you lived in a village or on a farm, the war is really not going to touch you. But this war is different. In the 14th century, this trend changed, and the most destructive war was a series of conflicts between France and England known as the Hundred Years' War. The war would temporarily shift the position of England and France regarding each other. France had been extremely powerful and England relatively weak. The Hundred Years' War would see a shift in that relationship. England, surprisingly, would be very successful against the French. So why do they fight? The war started over two main issues. The first was economics. The French wanted to strangle English access to wool on the continent, and this resulted in a trade war. But the war also was a dispute in feudal terms, with both the English and the French kings claiming the French throne. The French king died with no direct heir, and so you've got two men stepping forward claiming the throne. Through his French mother, Edward III, the King of England, actually had a legitimate claim to the French throne. The problem was the French voted that someone could not inherit the throne by a claim through a woman. Edward's claim was through his mother. So Edward III would not get the throne, and his French competitor, Philip VI, would. And at first, Edward III did not contest the decision. So he's like, okay, you can have it. But then the French keep pushing the economic issue, and meanwhile, Edward becomes more and more bitter about the whole situation. And it didn't help that Philip demanded that Edward bow down to him. We end up with war. And this dynastic struggle is going to last for more than 100 years. When the war began, the French believed that it would be an easy victory. In the 14th century, France was the most powerful nation in Western Europe. So the French kings thought that they would have an easy time defeating the English. And it's ironic because the English had the same idea. In fact, Edward at the beginning was so confident in England's victory that he even redid his coat of arms to incorporate the coat of arms of the French royal family. And so here you see his original coat of arms on the left, that's representing Richard the Lionheart, and then the one he created that he was going to use while he was king. Sadly, he never really got to use it. The war begins, and initially England's doing pretty well, which really did surprise the French. And one reason for this, for England's success, was because England was actually using some new weapons that the French did not have access to. For example, England defeated the French regularly, using a new weapon that the French didn't possess, the longbow. And this was a bow that was made of yew wood, which was much more flexible than the wood that was being used previously. This bow was much larger than the traditional bow, and as a result could fire an arrow much farther and with much more force. And so the English are having a lot of success. The French, meanwhile, are becoming demoralized because of their losses, because every time England wins, they gain more territory in France. But French fortunes improved with the arrival of Joan of Arc. She believed that God commanded her to drive the English out of France. Now, she was just an illiterate peasant girl, but she had visions. And so she ends up presenting herself to the French ruler and actually convincing him to give her command of the French army. And he ends up believing her and gives her command of the army. And in 1429 and 1430, under Joan's leadership, the demoralized French army begins to win a series of victories, which would ultimately culminate in the expulsion of the English from France. So, before Joan arrived, the English had made enormous territorial gains in France. After 1453, when the war ends, the English were essentially forced to abandon the war. Now, the English saw and believed that Joan was a threat, and because the French start winning after she comes along. So the English targeted her. They wanted to get her out of the picture. And in 1431, she is captured by the English, put on trial for witchcraft, found guilty, and burned at the stake as a witch. The English intended to undermine the French cause by demonstrating that Joan was not divinely chosen. It totally backfired, though, much like the Christian martyrs in early Rome, because Joan's life and death ended up inspiring the French people with a sense of devotion to their country. And they go on to have some more victories. Though the English will have some major successes, the French are able to reorganize and recapture Paris, driving the English from nearly all of their French territory by 1453. Here you see English possessions in 1415, the areas in purple. And so most of those were areas that had been part of France. And this is before Joan of Arc comes along. So as you can see, the English are controlling a lot of French territory. Well, after the war comes to an end, or by the time the war comes to an end, about the only foothold that the English still have is a port called Calais, up in the north. If you look, it's right there at the border of like the light purple and the darker purple. And this today, if you ever go over there, is a major port. So if you ever take the ferry from England to France, you'd probably go to Calais. So what are the results of this war? Well, this war represents a gigantic struggle between England and France, but it's one that really does not change the balance of power in the end. At the beginning and the end of the war, France was the more powerful nation. What was more important long term were the changes internally in France and England as a result of the war, as both the French and the English kings gained greater power to tax their people because they needed to finance the war. The French king gained the power to tax the people directly, the power of direct taxation. These funds furnished the French monarch with the means to organize a professional army of well-paid and loyal troops. By evoking a sense of pride and oneness in the French people, the war also contributed to a growing but still incomplete national unity, because up to this point, people tended to identify themselves with their region, the region from which they came, not with this concept of a nation. But with this war, you have soldiers from all over France coming together on an even playing field, fighting for a common cause. So we see greater solidarity, which lays the groundwork for the idea of nationalism. The English also emerged from the war with a greater sense of solidarity, and Parliament, because it had to finance the war, gained power itself. It gained in stature. So we see the state growing in England and France through the power of direct taxation in France and through the power of Parliament being able to tax in England. This war also set France and England on different paths. The war created a growing sense of national feeling, like I said, in France, and it allowed the French kings to expand their power. England ended up losing its French lands, but that setback was not as disastrous for them as it appeared in 1453. With their dreams of a continental empire shattered, English rulers began looking at new trading ventures overseas. And this is going to occur just as we are moving into the age of exploration. So England's going to end up creating an overseas empire that also prompts France to do the same. The third crisis was that of the church. Again, we've got problems with the church. By 1200, the Pope was the most powerful person in Europe. So, think of the popes calling crusades, calling church councils, creating new saints, telling kings what to do. But there was a huge price to pay. The papacy became as much a political power as a spiritual power. Some people, among them kings, began to act towards the papacy more in political than spiritual terms. The popes were successful in dominating over the Holy Roman emperors, but that left the most powerful state of France, and the popes aren't going to be as lucky with the French kings. By 1300, Philip IV of France even went so far as to send men to beat up Pope Boniface VIII when the pope seemed to contradict his political goals. By 1309, the French kings managed to get the popes to move to Avignon in France, where they generally supported French policies. But this made the popes less respected elsewhere. This was the Babylonian captivity, referring to the time when the ancient Hebrews were held captive in Babylon. It was really the end of the upward trajectory of the Church of the Middle Ages. From 1309 to 1378, the papacy would not reside in Rome, but in Avignon, France, and during this time, the popes were all French, and basically they were puppets of the French king. This resulted from a struggle between these two men. You've got King Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII. So what are they struggling over? Well, over a doctrine of Boniface's. This was the doctrine of unum sanctum, or papal supremacy. The Pope continued to uphold his claims to supremacy over secular rulers. To raise revenue for war, Philip taxed the churches in France. In doing so, he disregarded the church prohibition against the taxing of its property by the state without the permission of the Pope. When the Pope threatened excommunication, Philip refused to back down and asserted his authority over the churches in his kingdom. So at this point, Boniface backed down, declaring that the French king could tax the clergy in times of national emergency. So, at the moment, the matter was resolved to the advantage of the state. But when Philip tried and imprisoned a French bishop, despite the Pope's warning that this was an illegal act and a violation of church law and tradition, which held that the church and not the state must judge the clergy, Philip summoned the first meeting of the Estates General, And this was an organization in France, much like England's Parliament, but they only came together when the king called them. So he calls them together to gain the backing of the nation. Boniface issued his Unum Sanctum and threatened to excommunicate Philip. So the king was furious and he wanted to get back at the Pope. Philip was so outraged that he actually hired Italian mercenaries and enemies of Boniface to raid the papal summer palace in September of 1303 and capture the Pope. Now, the Pope was later released, but the event proved too much for him and he died a month later. Boniface's successors tried to appease Philip. Ultimately, the papacy moved to Avignon, where, as I've said, it stayed until 1378. This becomes known as the Babylonian captivity, hearkening back to the period when the Jews were dispersed throughout the Babylonian Empire. And during the Babylonian captivity, the papacy became subject to the will of the French king. Removed from Rome and deprived of revenues from the Papal States, the papacy was often forced to pursue policies favorable to France. In Avignon, popes reigned over a lavish court. Critics lashed out against the worldly, pleasure-loving papacy, and anti-clergy sentiment grew. They lived in their own palace, and here you see a reproduction. And here you see the real thing. And they lived in a palace. They ate the finest food off gold plates. They wore the finest clothes. And more people resented this. And within the church itself, reformers tried to end the captivity. Finally, Pope Gregory XI will return the papacy to Rome in 1378. And the Babylonian captivity will come to an end. Unfortunately, almost immediately upon its return to Rome, it was to suffer another problem, the Great Schism, sometimes called the Papal Schism. So what happens? Well, the papacy returns to Rome. Urban VI is elected pope that same year. But he abused and imprisoned several cardinals. Fleeing from Rome, the cardinals declared that the election of Urban had been invalid. They go to Avignon and they elect a new pope, Clement VII. And they're like, okay, so he's the real pope. Urban back in Rome, not the real pope. Unfortunately, Urban refuses to step down. Urban excommunicated Clement. Clement responded by excommunicating Urban. And to the utter confusion and anguish of Christians throughout Europe, there were two popes now, Urban ruling from Rome and Clement from Avignon. Clement VII ruled from Avignon, as I said, often chose policies favorable to the French king, very similar to what was going on during the Babylonian captivity. And Christians everywhere were just utterly confused by the whole situation. And this really did impact people's daily lives. Here you see a map of Europe during this time. So all the areas in red loyal to Avignon, all those areas in blue loyal to Rome. And you might wonder, well, how would this impact the ordinary Christian? Well, think about this. You get married. The priest who marries you was installed by a bishop. That bishop was installed by the Pope in Rome. What if that guy's not the real Pope? That means that that bishop is not a bishop, that priest is not a priest, you're not really married. After 3 decades of this, the church realized, and don't get me wrong, the church realized all along that they had a problem here, but they finally, in 1409, hold the Council of Pisa. It's attended by hundreds of churchmen, and they elect a new pope. And this is Alexander V. Unfortunately, neither deposed pope recognized the council's decision. And so now there were three popes. And European Christians, I'm sure, were just totally going nuts about this. It's like, who do you follow? Finally, a new council was called at Constance in 1414. A fourth pope is elected, Martin V, and in the struggle that followed, each of the other three popes either abdicated, that means stepped down, or was deposed in favor of an appointment by the council. And so finally, in 1417, the Great Schism comes to an end. But this did a lot of damage. As a result of these two events, the church loses a lot of power. And remember, the plague is ongoing as well early on, and people are questioning the church because of that. Now, because of these events, they're questioning the church. It damaged the idea of the sanctity of the church, and people begin to question divine infallibility. You know, how can these popes, these clergy, be perfect, protected by God when there's three of them? There's two of them. So the damage to these ideas was done. The church and the popes are never again going to wield the kind of authority that it had during the High Middle Ages. And this begins to lay the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. Because people are questioning the church, we begin to see men emerge who are known as dissenters because they disagree with what's going on in the church. And two early ones were John Wycliffe and John Hus. So Wycliffe was from England, Hus was from Czechoslovakia. Both of them opposed the opulence and corruption of the church, the luxurious living of the popes and church officials. Both Wycliffe and Hus believed that the Bible was the key to spiritual salvation, and that all one needed to do was read the Bible. Hus, unfortunately, was burned at the stake. Wycliffe was pretty much shut down by the church. Once the church was reunited, it quickly put down what they considered to be doctrinal heresies, such as these men were preaching. But they're important because they lay the foundation for Martin Luther. Martin Luther, who started the Protestant Reformation, will emerge in the early 1500s. And it's interesting because these two men had many of the same ideas that Luther did. One thing they did not have that Luther had access to, though, was a printing press. So Luther's ideas really took off because they could be dispersed among the people. These guys didn't have that luxury. We see men emerge who were known as free thinkers. And these free thinkers began to believe that you could not prove items of faith by reason. William of Ockham was one of the most famous critics. He was a monk who argued that reason should be separated from faith, and that reason is worth pursuing on its own behalf. He insisted that natural reason could not prove God's existence, the soul's immortality, or any other essential Christian doctrine. Reason could only say that God probably exists, and that he probably endowed man with an immortal soul, but it could not prove these things with certainty. The tenets of faith were beyond the reach of reason, said Occam. There was no rational foundation to Christianity. He did not seek to undermine faith, only to separate it from reason. In the process of proclaiming the authority of theology, Occam also furthered the use of reason to understand nature. His approach of separating natural knowledge from religious dogma made it easier to explore the natural world scientifically without fitting it into a religious framework. He's a forerunner of the modern mentality, which is characterized by a separation of reason from religion and an interest in the empirical investigation of nature. In a sense, the name Middle Ages, which again refers to the period between classical antiquity and modernity, is misleading because it suggests a wasteland that simply connected the ancient to the modern. But it was a time of new prosperity, new technological advances, and advances in art. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was poised on the brink of a new age and had begun tearing down many of the institutions characteristic of the Middle Ages, especially the church and feudalism. Also notable was the increasingly important role of classical Greek and Roman literature, which began with the discovery of the ancient philosophers. Later philosophers will work to separate classical reasoning and faith. We also begin to see a new emphasis on the world and on the capacity of human beings to enjoy life to the fullest, and that's tied to the plague. And this mindset, as I said earlier, will yield to the Renaissance. We begin to see different forms of literature emerge. Latin was the universal language of medieval civilization. Used in the church and schools, it enabled learned people to communicate anywhere in Europe. The intellectual revival of the High Middle Ages included an outpouring of Latin literature. But while Latin continued to be used for literary purposes, by the 12th century, much of the creative literature was being written in the vernacular, and that refers to the everyday languages of ordinary people, the language they speak, like French, German, Italian. These writings captured the spirit of the High Middle Ages. Medieval literature included epics about feudal warriors and tales of the common people. One of the most popular forms of vernacular literature of the 12th century was troubadour poetry. This was chiefly the product of nobles and knights. This poetry focused on themes of courtly love, the love of a knight for a lady who inspires him to become a braver knight and a better poet. Although it originated in southern France, troubadour poetry also spread to northern France, Italy, and Germany. Here is an example of a piece of troubadour poetry, The Firm Desire That Enters. And I'm not going to read it here, but if you are interested in reading it, you can just pause the slide and go through it. Another type of vernacular literature was the chansons de geste, or the songs of heroic deeds. These were written for a male-dominated society. The chief events described in these poems are battles and political contests. Their world was one of combat, in which knights fight courageously for their kings and lords, and women played little to no role in this literary genre. The most popular and earliest of the chansons de geste was the Song of Roland, written around 1100. And this poem praises the courage of one of Charlemagne's knights who died while on a military campaign in Muslim Spain. Roland was a true feudal hero. He loyally sacrificed his life out of a sense of honor. In the Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer, we follow a band of English pilgrims traveling to Thomas Becket's tomb. And in brilliant word portraits, the author sketches a range of characters, including a knight, a plowman, a merchant, a monk, a nun, the wife of Bath, a woman who's been widowed numerous times. Each character tells a story, and each tale adds to our picture of medieval life. And add to that, this is the first piece of literature written in the vernacular in English. One of the most extraordinary vernacular writers of the age was a woman, Christine de Pizan. Now, her father had a position at the court of Charles V of France, and because of that, she herself received a good education. Her husband died when she was only 25. They had actually been married for 10 years, but it left her with very little income and 3 small children and her mother to support. So she took the unusual step of becoming a writer in order to earn her living. Her poems were soon in demand, and by 1400 she had achieved financial security. Christine de Pizan is best known, though, for her French prose works written in defense of women. In a book called The Book of the City of Ladies, written in 1404, she denounced the many male writers who had argued that women needed to be controlled by men because women by their very nature were prone to evil, unable to learn, and easily swayed. With the help of reason, righteousness, and justice, who appear to her in a vision, Christine refutes these anti-feminist attacks. Women, she argues, are not evil by nature, and they could learn as well as men if they were permitted to attend the same schools. So here we see really one of the first feminists. And what we see overall is the start to a recovery during the 1400s. And this recovery will set the stage for further changes during the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Exploration. As Europe grew stronger, it would take a more prominent role on the global stage.